Okay, everyone. Apologies for the slight delay there, just get everything set up again. This is our final panel of day one here at Procurement and Supply Chain Live 2023, and this is the Supply Chain Risk and Resilience Forum. We've got a fantastic panel to take us through this today. Starting on the far side, we have Ashley Norton, formerly of McLaren, Rolls-Royce and Capgemini. In the centre, we have Cameron Smith, Global Procurement Senior Partner, Professional Services at Novartis. And closest to me, we have Aurélien Faucheux, CEO, Chief Executive Officer at HF&C. So warm welcome to our panel, please. Okay, you know the drill by now. We'll be going through a few different points first of all, and we'll go to your questions at the end as well. I'll leave plenty of time for those. So, a good place to start, and I'll put this to each of you in turn. What are the most critical supply chain risks that businesses are facing today? Ashley, I will start with you.
Just checking the mic, okay. Well, that's quite a difficult question, and I could answer it for about half an hour, to be honest. But I think risk really needs to be quantified in terms of risk themes. Risk themes are different for each type of business in each sector, whether it's regulated, non-regulated. So what I would say is that the use cases and those risk themes should really be identifying the data and the types of risks that you want to monitor. So for example, if you're a service industry and you're delivering product to customers, you want to be monitoring on-time delivery from your suppliers. You might want to also monitor their sourcing and their financial position. But if you're another entity, another organisation, something might be very different that you want to monitor and measure. So it is actually quite different, but it's unique to each organisation.
So it's the data. Whatever organisation is in, it's being aware of that data that
and how deep you go
in
terms of pulling in, ingesting that data, which is actually quite complex to do. It's not that easy, and we'll talk about that probably more during this conversation.
Of course, Cameron.
Yeah, I'm going to echo. Hello. I'm going to echo what Ashley just said. That I think it depends very much on the nature of the industry, regulated. Non-regulated, high margin, low margin, whether it's services, whether it's commodities, whether it's something that's multinational, whether it's something that's regional or even local. It very much depends on the nature of your business that will then allow you to assess the known and, as we were hearing before, the unknown knowns and unknown unknowns that you have in your business. I also think there's a lot of latent emerging risks that are becoming known increasingly with aspects like ESG and diversity and inclusion, not only in the organisation itself, but in the supply chain of the organisation. I mean, they're latent and risks in the sense that they need to be further developed, further investigated, further reported, but that's still an evolving technique. If you don't get that right, that's got market implications on you and your ability to sell a product or a service.
Aurélien.
Yeah, I would say that for the industry as a whole, and for automotive in particular, I would distinguish two types of risks. The first one is more external risk. We've seen a lot actually. I'm referring to the geopolitical risk, semiconductors, raw material, and then the internal risk that we, as a company, we are creating, whether it's through your credit rating degrading, through financial, when you are not paying your suppliers. These are some risks that actually you can influence, but that you are creating by yourself. So external and internal risk for me are the two ones actually that I would distinguish and act upon actually using a different action plan.
That is a good roundup to get us started with. And obviously with any risk, you want to develop effective mitigation strategies. What advice would all of you have about how to approach developing those? Because if you've identified the risks and the type of risks that you have, depending on your business or your sector, how do you go about actually developing effective strategies? And I'll put that open to all of you.
Well, I'll kick it off by saying have a plan, have a backup plan, and always have a backup plan to your backup plan. But understanding where your most exposure or the greatest level of exposure within your business, within your supply chain is, looking at things like frequency and severity of change and the impact that has or could have on your business, and then work back from that. I always take the view and recommend to others that you look at the worst case possible scenario and you work back from that. If you've got a supplier I used to use a supplier called Ajax Fasteners, very, very nondescript organisation. They were bolts. You can't make a car without bolts. If they're on financially shaky ground, that's where you start, and you work back from there to the bigger organisations that are less prone to sort of financial or supply chain risk. But start at the worst and then work your way back from that.
Yeah, I agree with Cameron actually, and I guess that communication is key. So you have to explain, being a supply chain or procurement professional, in fact, what is the risk, why is it a risk for the company, and in which sense actually, what are the consequences, as you said actually, the worst case scenario. And that's very key because, understanding the risk, coming from Asia, for example, is quite difficult to understand for any CFO, but when you explain actually the risk is that we stop the production line, and then it will cost X, Y, and Z, then that's a different story. So I would say communication is key, explaining what are the risks and what could be actually the worst case scenario, as Cameron said.
Yeah, I think personally, I guess expanding on from what my colleagues have been mentioning, we've said that you understand what you're interested in terms of the risk. Actually building a solution and the capability to identify risk and mitigate risk very early on is actually quite difficult. And a lot of organisations find it difficult to know how to start. Okay, the key thing is knowing what's important to you, how it impacts your business, whether it's availability of product, whether it's legislative risk. But once you know, you then need to segment how you're going to actually collect the data with a supply base that you've got, because it's actually quite complex. When you're talking about upstream supply chain mapping, for example, you've got second, third, fourth, and beyond. In some cases, we all saw the impact of semiconductors across multiple different sectors. So you need to decide what's important and then how you're going to build it. And there's different ways to build the resiliency capability, but it starts with knowing what's important, and then you figure out how am I going to collect the data, how am I going to use the data, how am I going to orchestrate it, and you then use it within the ecosystem, the enterprise that I'm working for.
And you get a bit of tunnel vision with people that have been ingrained in a business a long time, or conversely, not within the business long enough to understand what all of the risks are. I mean, no one knew what a semiconductor was until you couldn't buy or get a car delivered. Then all of a sudden it became the hot topic. So it becomes very, very real very, very quickly. But it's, I agree. It's around knowing your data, understanding, interpreting, and then looking for those pressure points on what the data is telling you.
Because I want to pick up on that thread about data. That was something I was going to come to later, but that seems like a good point now. We can be swimming in data. You can have data about data. How would you advise people actually go about interpreting and using that data effectively? Because you can have all this data, but if there's no action off the back of it, see what I mean? That's how would you advise people approach that problem?
I think, like Michael said in the previous session, I think the back to basics for me is fundamental. Meaning that, and as Ashley said, actually, understanding actually your whole supply chain from tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, tier 4 is key now. So if you got this known, and then you can monitor actually what are the risks that actually could occur given actually any political actually situation occurs. But each of the procurement or supply chain planner have to understand actually what is their supply chain and their supply chain of their actually suppliers, and that's fundamental. So back to basics first, and then we can speak about AI and the rest of digitalization. But first, the basics have to be right.
Yeah, and good data is objective. But you need a subjective overlay over that. So data is two-dimensional, but you need that third dimension of how you interpret it, what the purpose of it is it the right data, or am I looking at the right things? Am I looking at things like failure rates or warranty claims or other things in the right way in order to feed that into your upstream decision making? If you can't interpret that, it remains as two-dimensional. It's a spreadsheet of ones and zeros sitting there on its own without any useful purpose.
I think it comes back to the basics in terms of what's important for you as an organisation. If you're trying to attain 100% service level to your customers, then you need a supply base that can deliver a very, very high percentage of on-time delivery, whether that's 99% of the time or 95% of the time, and you take the stock liability and you absorb some of those issues, that naturally will always happen. But it's then determining, that's the KPI I'm trying to achieve, what data allows me to hit that goal. And if that is robustness in the supply base, we all now know that that means you have to look beyond your first tier. And then the question becomes, have I got the data? Is it available? Will it be made available, potentially, because some suppliers may not want to make the information available? And then how do I collect it? And that then becomes the key data stream to deliver true resilience from a delivery perspective. Now, there'll be other risk themes that you may want to pursue, different types of data, but once you've started to identify those critical data elements which are key to you delivering as a business, that's what you go after. And that's how you start to segment and cleanse all of this abundance of information which keeps flowing in all the time. You start to siphon it off and you focus on what's important for you.
Ashley, I'm fairly sure you've got view on my script from here, because I want to go into looking at different tiers next.
Okay.
Because everyone will know their first tier well, second tier less so, and so on. How important is it to really understand multiple tiers to protect yourself from risk? Because that's often where the risk comes from. It might be one special bolt, screw, washer in the fourth or fifth tier which could suddenly stop you making your product. How important is it, and how do you go about really understanding the lower tiers of your supply chain?
So there's different approaches. You can either negotiate it through procurement and purchasing, which takes time, takes energy, but you can collect the data over a period of time. Now, that's not scalable if you've got tens of thousands of suppliers, but if you've got 200 suppliers, it might be scalable, okay? You can also use AI and data in terms of the intelligence which is out there, but accept an element of inaccuracy with the data that comes in. You have to decide as a business what's acceptable for you, and then that drives you to do one or two things. You mine for it, or you actually bring it in through technology. So there's two different approaches, and it may be that you use both, okay? But that's how you start the journey, and it's something which won't happen overnight. It's going to take months and years in some cases.
I'd look at that even further, and I'm in a different industry to the automotive sector, but knowing that sector, using engineers, or in the case of Novartis, your chemists, your chemical engineers, your pharmacists, etc., to understand that. Now, the company I work for doesn't have tiers to the same level as automotive or IT or others. So it goes down one or two because they like to control inputs to outputs. But understanding the chemical composition, the manufacturing process, distribution lines, and really pulling apart each of those, and again prioritising the ones that are most critical and most liable to failure, picking apart those, looking for those failure points is the way. But you can't, you've got a limited time of resources, you've got limited people to go down to pick all of that apart. So you've really got to focus your energy on understanding where the critical failure points are.
For me, it's fundamental. In the industry, in the world that we're living in, understanding the whole supply chain is key. So that's a differential factor, and that's actually a key success factor actually for all of us. So remember, when I was at Stone, we run actually a complete data analysis on our whole supply chain, and we've discovered actually that we're sourcing some raw material from everywhere actually in the world. But that's the way it is. So you have to understand actually your supply chain, and procurement and supply chain have to be hand in hand working on this topic, because it's fundamental to assess, prevent, and monitor actually the risk. Yeah.
I think just an additional point as well to the question about how important is it. We all know it's important in all industries and sectors, but there are certain sectors which are particularly vulnerable to issues in the upstream supply chain, and that's where you've got quite complex technology or intellectual property. Mm-hmm. So I've worked in aerospace for a lot of my career. I've worked also in automotive and supercar manufacturing, and where you've got the limited ability to resource if there's problems, that's where you're particularly susceptible if you've got a very, very specific capability in a supplier upstream, that fails. You've got nowhere to resource to. So it becomes very critical, dependent on the sector that you're working in, to identify how important it is. I think it is important in all industries, but particularly where you've got R&D and IP and technology involved, that's when you're going to get really, really burnt because you've got nowhere else to go.
We spoke briefly about the value of technology, the value of AI and so forth. Do we feel that is really, as that progresses, really changing the landscape about how people can protect themselves and make themselves more resilient? Is that making a significant difference now? Will it continue to? Where do we see that going?
For me, no difference whatsoever. The commodities and the services that I'm predominantly buying, my team are buying, do rely upon the exercise of judgment. And that's the squishy person behind the keyboard exercising their judgment with the data that's presented in front of them. But it's also the ability to communicate with stakeholders and suppliers and other parties in a transaction to ensure that the judgment is made in the right call. And I'm sure at some point AI or some sort of technological advancement will catch up. But at the moment, indirect services, consulting, legal services, et cetera, do rely a lot more on human judgment than they do on technology. No change for me.
Mm-hmm. I think the use of AI and automation is becoming more prominent, and it will continue to become more prominent. It certainly can help to manage the volume of information that you may want to capture as an organisation. So if we're going to talk about analytics of a very large and complex supply base, that's where AI and automation can help at least alleviate some of the legwork which a traditional purchasing or procurement organisation may have to do, particularly as we're all trying to lean and become more efficient. It's a way to enable the organisation to at least see some of those insights without having an army of people to do it. So I think there's a balance, and I think over time it will change. There'll always be the human element there, but I think the bias towards kind of the data, the analysis will become more technology driven, with the final decisions being made at the professional, functional level.
Yeah, I see a big potential, as Ashley and Cameron said, in AI and the treatment of the external risk and the information linked to our supply chain, especially when it comes to monitoring, but also assessing what could be the worst case scenario. So, i.e., for example, any country going closing the frontier, what's going to be the impact. So having a few scenarios actually being built through AI will help actually the decision makers to take the right decision at the right point in time. So are we there yet? No. Are we going there? Yes. So, and I'm quite optimistic about AI. Yeah.
We've spoken quite a bit about how organisations can develop and strengthen their supply chain resilience already. We've looked at different methods, different ideas, different things to look for. But I'm sure every business would say that takes investment. That takes manpower, it takes experience, it takes technology, or a mixture of all of them. How would you advise people, if they're looking to develop their supply chain resilience, they get that internal investment to make those kind of improvements? How do you go about making that case?
So I think for me it's a cross-functional actually activity. As I said before, supply chain, quality, procurement have to go hand in hand and work actually on minimizing actually the risk. Also investing in a good sales and operation process. I remember when I was at Aston, actually, Martin Corner, my counterpart, and I have worked on supply chain improvement and how to optimize actually the sales and operation process in order to, when the risk occurs actually and risk happen, then actually we are able to react immediately to protect the production and then to protect at the end our customers. So investing in people, investing in technology, and seeing beyond actually what are the further risks that actually could occur. Yes.
I think the big thing is monetizing it. It's quantifying. Talking about what I was raised before, looking for the worst case scenario. Once you've monetized that worst case scenario, it presents a really powerful case that if you can prove that cause will equal effect or not cause will equal effect, it gives you a very powerful case to say the investment of 100,000 whatevers in this could save tens of millions down the track, is a very, very powerful case of doing it. But you have to have all of your ducks lined up in a row to say, this is what could happen, this is the, and looking at the severity and the frequency, or the potential severity and the potential frequency of these events could lead to that. Once you've monetised it, you get accountants take notice, CFOs, CEOs, operations, a raft of people will start coming out realising the magnitude of that problem and the possibility or the probability of that risk eventuating.
I think sometimes you just have to guess and be bold and take that plunge, if I'm being honest. Monetising the data is something we talk about in consultancy quite a lot. And Cameron's exactly right. You have to put some financials to things, because that's the way that business is still engineered. It's engineered by top line and bottom line. But you can be creative in how you create the business case, and actually making some assumptions, some logical assumptions, even if you don't have the data to support it, is a good way forward. It shouldn't be a barrier not to actually move forward. I think businesses often see a lack of data or an overload of data as a reason not to do something, but you need to find the innovation in presenting the business case to actually drive it forward.
And we saw quite clearly, end of 2019, 2020, what happens when you haven't planned for something that wasn't known. So you can use that as in your back pocket to say, this is what we didn't plan for before. Now we've got to look beyond what we used to plan for, what was relevant in 2018 and before, because the game has changed. And we need to think that this is a possibility, or something adjacent to that could be a possibility. And I think that's scared a lot of people at the C-suite and just below the C-suite into realising that things aren't what they used to be, that it's a new world order, that reliance on cheap Russian gas in Germany has resulted in costs of production in Germany skyrocketing. But that wasn't known before they went over the border into Ukraine and caused that conflict. Now I think there's a lot more scenarios that have played out that have caused cost, that have made people sit up and take notice at the C-suite.
And I think supply chain has to be part of the C-suite now. I mean, the voice of supply chain is now becoming very, very clear. Given all the crises that we've gone through actually over the last 3 years now, I think supply chain has a big role now to play in the organization, and they have to be part, actually, we have to be part of the C-suite in order to strengthen actually and raise our concern when it comes to any risk.
Because this is very much where I wanted to go to next, and that is the lessons that we've learned since the pandemic, because it was such a seismic event, it had such an impact on supply chains. What do you feel we've learned? What do you feel we do differently now as a result of those very, very unusual 18 months or so? It's a huge question, I know.
Honestly, not enough. We've not done enough. There is a very, very strong and frequent conversation around supply chain resiliency. But I think to translate that into actionable progression is not where the language is. So I think there's still a lot to do to move things forward. I think the awareness is there, but the progression within businesses doesn't meet the awareness that has been there for the last 2 or 3 years.
Why don't you think it's moving quickly enough, though?
I think it stems back to the conversation we were just having about value and monetising. What needs to happen generally across industry is that there needs to be a recognition of a different type of value. It's not just top line and bottom line, or certainly when you do the business cases, it needs to translate what does being sustainable mean. Does it mean that we're going to carry less, let's say, legislation risk? Can we lower our So you need to translate it in a different way, and I think most organisations, or certainly a large percentage of organisations that I've worked with in the last 3 or 4 years, struggle to actually create that business case. And the KPIs, which are locked into the DNA of the organisation, don't allow them to. And that's where the rub is, and that's why things are not progressing as fast as we need them to.
Okay, we're staying with lessons learned post-pandemic. Any further ones you'd add?
Yeah, when I was Nissan back in 2019, and I presented actually the risk linked to a semiconductor, then I got all the manufacturing and the CFO looking at me like, what are you talking about? You know, what's a semiconductor, first of all? Then when actually the issue happened, then, as we say, it spread everywhere. So, and then it was a big crisis. But as Ashley said, I think we're not that there yet. I think in terms of awareness, yes, we are. I think that's a good sign that actually supply chain and procurement are heard now. Have we acted deep enough and efficient enough? Probably not. And that's the reason why, coming back to my comment about supply chain should be part of the C-suite to get actually more vocal actually and to get more power actually as part of the decision process. Should the KPI also be changed? Yes, also. That's quite important because at the end of the day, the objective is to secure the production line. And that's really what we should do now. So there is a long way to go. But the good news is that now we're being heard. So don't hesitate to shout, don't hesitate to speak out and to explain what are the risks.
Nothing's off the table. I kind of look at some of the known risks that were present in 2019, and now you look at the laundry list of other things that could go wrong in say the pharmaceutical industry, and nothing is off the table. Geopolitical, health, pandemic, energy, ESG, diversity. It's so broad, and I think the one thing that we have come through this is businesses in the main have become a lot more agile in their ability to respond to things. Now, it's response after the fact rather than pre-planning, because I think there's so many things, there's so much a greater magnitude of things that can go wrong that you can't pre-plan for everything. Yeah. What you can do is set in place some parameters for how you would like to respond. But I think that's one of the things that has come positively out.
Okay, I do have more questions I'd like to go through, but I will turn to the room, see if there's any questions, any hands going up of questions. We have one at the back there, and then we'll come to the front.
Hi, I was just checking it's working. Yeah, I'm Daniel, and supply chain consultant at Allegis. Just got a question around outsourcing, and lots of companies are outsourcing their, say, shared service centres abroad. Do you see this as kind of a risk or a benefit for the supply chain?
Doing one at the moment. I see it as a problem that helps someone get a problem off their desk for a period before the risks materialise and everything goes full circle. And I've been around long enough to see this cyclical nature of it. It's in-source, near-shore, offshore, in-source, near-shore, offshore, in various ways. It happens enough. But I think a lot of the decision-making to shift something away from being core or semi-core part of your business is often to alleviate a financial or an operational or some other problem. But not all of the risks of doing so are known at the time. When they crystallise, it's oh Jesus, let's bring it back inside. And then the cycle repeats.
Anything further from you two, or no?
Yeah, I would echo what Cameron's saying. I do think it comes back to understanding who you are and what you stand for as a business. And certainly one of the things one should ask yourself in business is what's the perception of my customers in terms of my service to them, and what's important, what do I do that others do really well. And that starts to get you into a kind of a thought mode around what's your operating model and what's core and what's not core. So I think it can work. I think there is always risk when you outsource, but I think if you apply the right logic and you go through the right process of determining why you're outsourcing, that will de-risk to a certain extent.
You can save $1 on invoice payment. If your supplier doesn't get paid and it stops the production line, that can cost thousands per minute. And that's what I'm talking about in terms of monetising it. So you've got to be aware of the possibility, the frequency, and the magnitude of the eventuality, and be prepared for that if it happens. If it all goes smoothly, no one ever cares about it all going smoothly. You care if it goes wrong.
That's another slogan that we need on a T-shirt, I think. That's one of the ones we've added today. Any further hands that were going up? I think that was next just there, and then we'll come over to you on the right.
Okay, thank you. So first I would like to thank the panel. I truly appreciate the diversity in the approach to risk and resilience of supply chains around the world. So I'm a pharmacist. My question will be to Cameron first.
I'm not.
I would like you to elaborate more about the lessons learned from the pandemic, because I remember we were really struggling to provide medicines and protective equipment for the hospitals and so on. So today we have a lot of tools, AI and data we collected all along. So I would like to know, what do you think we should do to prepare for the worst case scenario, which will be another pandemic?
So, I mean, I'm not a pharmacist. I'm not a chemist at all. But I do know two things that was significant failure points for the healthcare industry. One was PPE, because I think the scale of this was so far off the charts, bigger than what we had ever possibly envisaged, that no one could ever foresee that we would need X million gowns and gloves and masks and hand sanitizer and surgical tools, etc., etc. So that's the unknown event. I think what we have learned from the pandemic, from the medical side of things, is the data that it was stored and gathered through various test trials enables us to put RNA vaccines into fruition very, very quickly. So people were campaigning about this vaccine hasn't been tested. Well, no, actually, if you look at the long tail of stages of development of the vaccines, and I'm not pro or against, it happened, I've had mine, there's a long genesis that was able to be interpreted to target particular nuances of the COVID and the derivatives of the COVID virus very, very quickly. So that data became incredibly important. You look at the polio vaccine, took 9 months from start to finish. This was a lot more complex, but the genesis of the RNA vaccines, I understand, was 10 to 15 years, and there's a lot of offshoots of development of other drugs and vaccines. So the data is critical. Gathering that data along the path is critical, and we're getting better and better and better at doing that to put stuff into the market very, very quickly.
Okay, thank you very much. I think our next question was just over there.
I'm really sorry, it's two questions. Data, you've all mentioned data, it looks backwards. Can you just talk a little bit about projecting it forward? And I suspect that goes to Cameron's point on adding a third dimension, which I think was an interesting point. The second question, and I think it might only be Ashley, having looked at your profiles, if you were or are working with the public sector, what risks do you foresee with the new PCRs?
I'll kick the data one off. Data is an asset that doesn't appear on any balance sheet, doesn't appear in any sort of tangible form, but is gathered throughout the life cycle. It's one of the biggest assets of any organisation. You can't make a car without data, you can't fly a plane without data, you can't make vaccines without data. It's the gathering, the harnessing, the prioritising, and the understanding and the interpretation of that data that is critical. In terms of the public sector, I don't have a dog in that fight. That's beyond my remit.
Just to address the second question, perhaps not the best person to speak on public sector. Certainly I've worked with aerospace and defence and government agencies, but in terms of kind of that proactive, that forward-looking data, I think that's where the use of technologies like AI and machine learning will start to be more prevalent and will start to give us that third dimension that we don't currently use or see as much of today. How we use that, I think time will tell, and each industry will perhaps be more regulated in how they use that data. So that's kind of where I see things going.
Okay, thank you very much. We think one last question here at the front.
Thank you, guys. So my question is based on the point that you guys made that it's still not a good enough business case to take supply chain risks more seriously, and we just had a pandemic and we're still going through a lot of crises. So what do you think is going to take for companies to actually take these things seriously and put more of an emphasis on supply chain risk management?
I look at this in terms of like buying insurance, which we all do for cars and houses, and we all look at our own risks and the frequency, the severity and the magnitude of what we do on a day-to-day level. That's what a business needs to do. Your insurance policy for your car is only as good as when you have it or you don't have it or you need to make a claim. Failure will be probably the biggest driver of behaviour, sadly, because each mitigant that you're trying to implement will have a cost attached to it, which then impacts on the bottom line. So you will see a lot more resistance to things that the C-suite don't believe adding long-term value, if that has an impediment on the EBITDA of the business or whatever else you're trying to represent with the value of your business. But I think failure, sadly, is going to be the impetus towards change.
Probably the easiest way for me to articulate some kind of answer that most people would resonate to. Organisations have been mitigating risks through buying inventory for decades. I see data as not being any different. So you might not necessarily need to buy all of the inventory, but actually you need to buy data to mitigate that liability of carrying inventory. And you won't get the balance quite right. But data is no different from products, in my view. It's about buying what you need to actually allow you to operate in a much more effective and resilient way. So that would be a way that I would describe, that business case element to it. Quantify data differently. It's not just data. You're buying an asset, and that's the real value.
Yeah, and I think it's down to us as supply chain procurement professionals to speak up, to raise the concern, to raise the risk, to explain and explain and explain. And as Cameron said, if anything happened, then at least, would have warned actually the C-suite, would have warned actually the execs, say, okay, this could happen, be aware, be prepared. And things will move. We'll have more and more tools that will help us actually to better do our job, but communicate, raise the risk, raise the concern, explain.
Okay, thank you everyone for all of your questions. A big thank you to the panel, Ashley, Cameron and Aurelian. Thank you.